My name is Mark Pagán. I'm the producer and creator of Other Men Need Help. And we're going to be doing a talk today on finding your podcast voice and tone. All around, we've got an hour here. I've got about 45 minutes to do a presentation, and we'll have some Q&A afterwards. So I might go fast. If I'm going too fast for a lot of you, then just comment. It's a small team, so they're going to try to monitor the comments as best they can, but I will try to slow down. And what we're doing today is a bit of a few tenets that I find helpful and a bit of a case study as well. And what I'm advising in the following slides is not necessarily the order that you should do things, but what I think most of us should do, whether we're starting or continuing a podcast. Again, 45 minutes is not a lot of time. And we have there's a lot to say, a lot of lofty information when it comes to your voice and tone for your show. Eric, if you could go to the next slide. So take a screenshot or write this down. A lot to talk about today. We're not going to get through all of it. So if you have follow-up questions, I will do the best I can if you want to send them to the Other Men Gmail. And then as well, just generally, if you have pitches for the show, we'd love to hear from people. So let us know. Eric, go to the next slide, please. So I'd like to start things off with a quote. And here's this Peter Aguero quote. Regardless of the show that you're doing, I mean, podcasting is a storytelling medium. So I really, really dig what Peter says here. If you tell a story about the time your house caught on fire, that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is what you grabbed first. So I think this goes into like a general tenet here of what is the specificity of the story that you're trying to tell. Again, you could be doing a chat cast, you could be doing a narrative nonfiction show, but what is it that you are uniquely qualified to talk about? Next slide, please. So Other Men Need Help is my show. If you haven't listened yet, well, you should, but that's not a big deal for today at all. You'll get a lot of information about how we went into finding the voice and tone for the show and things that we developed even before we started recording. Like I said, I'll offer a bit of a case study today on the show. And I want to start things off like things that we need to get out of the way regarding voice. Next slide. So before me, after me, you're going to hear people say, just do the damn thing. If you guys aren't already starting a podcast, if you're in the midst of a podcast, if you're doing another kind of show, whatever it is, consistency matters. And if it's not a podcast yet, simple things like journaling or, I know it's a weird time right now to say like go on stage and tell a story, but wherever you can consistently try to practice or getting on and maybe doing interviews in places, whatever you can do, just make it consistent and keep making the thing. Do it over and over and over and over again, and eventually you'll find your eureka place. I know that is not something that all of us want to hear, but it really does come down to as simple as that. The thing is, you need to find a way, regardless of how you're doing it, whether it's journaling or whether you're going and telling stories somewhere, or whether you're already making episodes of something, you need to find a way to notice what you particularly notice, or how you think, what you think about, and how you express what you think about. Go to the next slide, please. So journaling is one way, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the development of Other Men Need Help, as well as kind of what I've been doing for the last 5 or 6 years for projects. Journaling is for me just how I've been able to identify what I feel particularly qualified to talk about. And this is an obsessive thing that I'm about to tell you. I don't necessarily advise it. If it's helpful for you, if it's something you want to try, go for it. Because the bulk of 3 seasons, 3 years of Other Men Need Help has really been drawn from this habit. So I'll explain to you what this slide means here. I don't know how I discovered this or why this was the thing I discovered, but this is what I decided to do. I was finding, a friend of mine advised me 5 years ago. He's like, start a newsletter. He's like, just start a newsletter so that you can have an accountable place in which people are coming to, in which you can also develop like what you want to talk about. And so I thought that was a great first step. And I was like, I have no idea what every month I want to talk about in a newsletter, but I do want something consistent. So I was like, let me figure out what I'm observing. What am I paying attention to every day? So what I started to do was, I have an iPhone. Some of you do, some of you don't, but most of us have a smartphone these days. And on that smartphone, you have a memo app. And I would write notes, just little observations throughout the day of what I would see. The next morning, I would come to a journal and I would translate those notes, and they'd be brief notes, into whatever I could remember, as many details. You know, I was at Costco yesterday. Actually, I haven't been to Costco in 10 years. Let's scratch that. I was at the diner yesterday and I saw this thing and blah, 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 blah. So that would be step 2. Step 3 is I had a Google Drive. Again, this is very obsessive. I had a Google Drive that was I would write down these notes into separate docs at the end of the week, so that I could see what I was paying attention to, what organically I was paying attention to. And from there, those went into folders. And eventually, that started developing into a theme. And I was noticing I was paying a lot of attention to not only my own behavior, but the behavior of other men publicly. And that moved into a script format. There's a lot of area in between that, but I figured the way to both get a newsletter that could identify my voice, as well as what ended up becoming Other Men Need Help, is I needed to figure out how I was observing, how I was remarking on what I was observing. And then once I got into the script process, tried to pull from there. Why was I so focused on that guy in the diner and what he was doing? I think go to the next slide, actually. So it comes down to both this process as well as anything that you're doing. The question that you have to keep asking yourself, because other people need to know this. From the second you start an episode to 5 years in, even when you're doing the 500th episode, why are you the one to tell this story? And I know that not everybody here is doing a traditional, say, storytelling podcast, but podcasting is a storytelling medium. So whether you're doing an interview show or a chat cast, or you're doing something experimental, any format, why are you the expert and why are you uniquely qualified to talk about this? You must be able to answer this question at any point. And so this is something that, regardless of what stage you're in, you need to keep coming back to this question. And this question to me is, I have an analogy, just me personally. Let's go to the next slide. For me, why are you the one to tell this story is sort of like why you should date me. Because we're out here, whether you've done a dating app or whether you just kind of meet people wherever you go, when you're dating, you're trying to tell people why they should date you, right? And you personally, you're not trying to date everyone. You wouldn't want to date everyone. And if you would, then send me an email, because I do want to talk to you for the show. But not everybody out there is going to be into your mojo, and you're not going to be into everybody else's mojo, but you need to be able to qualify why you are a dateable person. Let's go to the next slide. And one of the ways that you do this, both in terms of being dateable as well as making something like a podcast, is you figure out, one of the main things is, what are you not? Okay, like on Tinder, I hope that many of you, men in particular, you don't have too many of your pictures with tigers, because there's a lot of you out there. So how are you going to be the outlier in the landscape of men with tigers? If you are doing a podcast about tender men with tigers, it may exist, may not. I would listen to it though. So Other Men Need Help went through a similar, like, what do we not want to be in the landscape of podcasting? But more honestly, and this is something you should ask yourself, you are an audience member. What are you tired of? What are you tired of hearing? What are you tired of seeing? What is missing from the landscape? Remember that at the end of the day, you are an audience member too. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the things I'm going to get into a few areas of Other Men Need Help is a podcast on paper. It's a podcast about masculinity, which is like, there are a million. I'm sorry if your ears are tender here, but I'll curse a little bit. There are a million fucking podcasts about masculinity out there. That's not very unique. So we took a look at, and I personally took a look at it, like, what am I consuming and what do I not want this show to, what can I bring in that's different from what's out there and what's missing for me. So there are a million podcasts out there that are sort of these roundtable discussions, whether it can be multi-gender, it can be all men, all women, whatever it is. But it's just like people sitting around a table, bunch of mics, and talking about, and in particular, talking about masculinity and gender without any level of reflection. So that was one thing that we were like, we do not want to be this show. So yes, my quote here, gentlemen, let's spend 60 minutes analyzing the terrible behavior of other men without reflecting on why we keep sending out the out of the blue messages to our exes, which are called blueies. We do an episode about that. Next slide, please. The other show, or the other sort of like men's format we did not want to do, is the Let's Fix It or Lifestyle Cast. And you see this, I think men's media in general is very guilty of this. It's sort of like Men's Health, the magazine, is made up of 90 pages of 12 crunches you can do to get over your ex. So this is something that we felt like there was a plethora of in the medium. We did not feel we needed to amend. We did not need to appease to doing a sort of format like this. So today we look at 12 wildly expensive luxury items that would try to make you feel like a playboy when you just want to talk to someone about what's going on in your head right now because you Googled your girlfriend's ex and found out he looks like a Hemsworth. We also do an episode about that too. Next slide, please. Although he did not look like a Hemsworth. He was a Puerto Rican painter named Pablo, and he was fucking gorgeous. Okay, finally, the other thing that we felt is way, not just with podcasting, and I will get a bit binary here in terms of media and talking about male-led media. There is a lot of controlling the narrative in male-led media, and that could be just hosts on the news. It could be, of course, a podcast. It could be a movie like 500 Days of Summer, which I actually have a lot of beef with, but we won't get into. That's a different webinar. Anyway, what we did want to stay away from is what I call the controlling the narrative too much cast. There's a lot of those out there. Joe Rogan on the right here. I know there's like 90% of you really like Joe Rogan. I don't have any beef or anything that I'm gonna say ill about Joe Rogan here, but traditionally, like Joe Rogan and a lot of surrogates have, and a lot of comedy podcasts too, I was sort of like, I can say whatever I want because everything I say is like, I'm just an asshole, right? The other thing that we wanted to avoid, we felt that there was a lot of in the landscape, was the sort of like, the Other Men Need Help can definitely be very guilty of being sensitive, but the sensitive without a level of reflection or ownership. So we have what I call the open mic guy here saying, expressing my feelings make me look attractively sensitive, but he'll never hear the backstory about how I don't take off my shirt during sex. So anyway, this is going to be a personal webinar as well. That's not me on the left, by the way, in terms of my narrative, but we do get into this sort of stuff in the show. Let's go to the next slide, please. So I'm coming back to a quote here, a slide that's a quote. And this here, that we have 3 or 4 examples in the previous slides of things that we decided, sort of like the Tinder thing in the dating world. What are we not? What are we reacting to? There's so many of these sorts of shows here. So how can we fall? What is like the voice that sits in my gut? And what can I do that'll thematically, what can I do that will speak to what's missing in the landscape right now, basically? And I love this quote from George Orwell, and it's been like an overall tenet I've had for anything I've done the last X amount of years, especially when you're doing anything personal. Autobiography is only to be trusted if it reveals something disgraceful. And that is something that really propelled us as we started the first season of Other Men Need Help. Can you go to the next slide, Eric? So from there, we have what we didn't want to sound like, what kind of shows were already existing in the landscape. And like, great, okay, want to be, it's going to be a personal show. It's not going to be a lifestyle cast or something in which we're going to have a roundtable discussion. But what do we want this to feel like? Okay, we can answer some of these things, but like, what is this supposed to feel like for an audience if it's not going to be one of those shows? Eric, I think you can go to the next slide. So what I can bring, oh, I think I'm missing some stuff here. Eric, can you go to the next slide just in case? Okay, go back. It's fine. I think I'm missing a slide here, but that's, I can explain it. So there are actually three pieces, or two others, including joy here, that we felt were missing from the landscape that we could bring. Vulnerability, accountability, and joy. We felt that a lot of the shows that we were looking at, but actually as an audience member, again, going to yourself as an audience member, a lot of what was missing was accountability. There was a level of vulnerability that we wanted to hear. And also the shows felt really joyless. They didn't feel like they were having fun. Gender can feel like gender studies often when it's discussed. I mean, even the word gender can feel a bit scientific. So how can we avoid that? What can we do to make this feel like something else? Go to the next slide. So what is joy? And we sort of like looked specifically at that word. Vulnerability and accountability, we can build into the storytelling process. We can figure out ways editorially to hold ourselves accountable. But what does a show feel like when it's talking about masculinity? It's a podcast and it's supposed to be joyful. What does that look like? What does that feel like? So, you can call it whatever you want. It could be a mood board that you can use. You can look at different aesthetics, but you should be able to answer at some point what your show, what your podcast looks or feels like if it was a different medium. I'm not saying you should try to aim for your podcast to be turned into a TV show or a book or a movie. Not at all. That's not what I'm trying to advise here. But you should be able to make an analogy to like, it looks or feels like this. And I actually think this might be the most helpful tenet that I had when putting together Other Men Need Help. Podcasting is a hybrid of a number of mediums. The genesis goes way beyond radio, although we say it's coming from radio and public radio and things like that, and that's true. But podcasting comes from RSS feeds, which came from blogging. People brought in a lot of different aesthetics into blogging as well. And we're in a very, very experimental landscape right now where you can do a lot. So anyway, I don't want to get on too much of a digression, but let's go to the next slide. So this is something that that came to be a bit of our log line, our like mission statement internally. Joy for us, something that felt joyful, that felt accurate in terms of the tone of our show, was Sesame Street. Now, I don't know, there are children's podcasts and things like that, and our show wasn't supposed to be for children. It was supposed to be for adults. And so that's something else we labeled. And then it's particularly about men. It's focusing on masculinity and sort of like the pitfalls of masculinity and things like that. And this became our guiding light. Just a very, very simple mission statement. How can we make a podcast that's Sesame Street about men for adults? We can go to the next slide. So how can we translate the elements, and how can you translate the elements from the mediums in which your show has, I want to say this in a way that I feel like I'm burping on my own language here. How can you take, like, if your show feels like, if you were to do a podcast, like I want it to feel like the movie The Godfather, how does that translate back to being a podcast about whatever, cooking? I'm doing a cooking show, a podcast that's a cooking show about Southwestern recipes, and I want it to feel like The Godfather. My God, that is an awesome proposition. I'm so curious about how you can translate that. And what a cool experiment. So we wanted to figure out, like, Sesame Street is super visual. It is super visual. It also includes puppets and music, and it's also for 4-year-olds. How do we translate the idea of like ghosting for men in a audio only landscape? So here's some things that we did, and here's some ways in which we tried to translate sort of like the principles of something like a Sesame Street into the podcast Other Men Need Help. Go to the next slide, please. I'm just going to take a second to look at the questions too, just to make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay. Cool. And then Eric, if you want to send me a message at any point, this is an informal note to Eric, the great Eric, who's running the slides, or anybody on the training team, if I should answer any questions.
Good. Thank you, Mark.
All right, so let's keep going. And again, by in about 15 minutes or 20 minutes, we should have time for questions, but I'm going to keep running through this. So I'm going to geek out a little bit with all of you and talk about Miroslav Sasik. And I'm probably butchering his name. He was a Czech illustrator, mid-century Czech illustrator. I think he immigrated to, I think he was, I don't know where, but I think he immigrated to the United States sometime mid-century. And he did these children's books, which some of you who are listening probably read and maybe still read. And they were these great, beautiful, sort of like travel guides for places all over the world. So this is San Francisco, this is New York, this is Paris, this is London. And so we took a little bit of a leap, or maybe not a leap, but we created a bridge between Sesame Street and children's literature. And like early sort of like 50s, 60s, 70s children's literature, not just Miroslav Sasik, but Ezra Jack Keats, and a few other people, and just like the simplicity and that, like, honestly, that joy that gives me as an adult reading these books. They're so visual and beautiful. Like, how would that felt like the right template is if we were to take like a children's book like This Is New York, translate that into an episode that's like Other Men Need Help presents This Is Ghosting. Other Men Need Help presents This Is Toxic Masculinity. Other Men Need Help presents This Is the Bluey, the out of the blue messages you send your ex. And so the first thing, and I don't necessarily advise this, but in some ways I totally do. If you are starting your show, if you're in the 5th season of your show, this is something I did before I'd even finished scripts, is I hired an illustrator. I got a logo done, but more specifically, I got show art done for each of the 7 episodes of the first season. Because I wanted I literally wanted a visual mood board of like, I need to match whatever the visual element of this is, that needs to match like that in my gut, like M. Sasik and This Is New York, like that needs to match audio wise and storytelling wise what we do visually. So I put my money where my mouth is, hired an illustrator, and started getting illustrations done for the first season without an episode recorded. Let's go to the next slide. And so her name was Iga, and she's really great. I'm happy to recommend her to anybody who's looking for an illustrator. She's in Poland. And Iga, her and I just worked on, I didn't illustrate them, but her and I worked on sort of like the tone of like, what is the visual cue of it? What would an audience member encounter based on this visual cue once they put on their headphones and listen to this show? And so we went through sort of like a template of like 60s, 70s imagery of masculinity and came up with sort of like these labels, like the pageantry of masculinity. That's Giancarlo Giannini on the right from Seven Beauties. You need to watch that movie if you haven't. Next slide, please. And again, playing with these ideas of just like the performance of being a man, especially like an era of man as well. Now the movie doesn't, sorry, not the movie, but Other Men Need Help doesn't tell stories specifically from like 1968 to 75. Quite on the contrary, they're very contemporary stories. But there's something about the fun. And we're not necessarily, we don't mock anybody at all. I think that's a major tenet in our show. But you should, there's something that feels like, I think the performance of like that era of masculinity allows a lot of audience members to come in, so it doesn't feel like gender studies 101. That's me personally. And not just the 1960s and 70s. Go to the next slide, please. But just like all the emblems of the ways that the idolatry of men and masculinity. And hopefully this makes sense if you've listened to the show. And if not, I hope you do at some point. But this was This was before we had a script, guys. I had 7 episode ideas and they weren't all written. And how in the world? Like, I just felt like the right step for me. So translate your influences, translate what your show would look like and sound like in another medium. If it's not a movie or a children's book, what would it look like as an album? What would it look like as a anthology of poetry? What would it look like if it was a 7-course meal? Like, if the feeling of a 7-course meal, shit, I mean, we do things where we do a whole episode and it's like, I want this to feel like the way my aunt used to, my aunt used to cradle my hand when I used to come visit her in Puerto Rico and make me arroz con pollo and just sit there and just touch my hand while I ate it. I was like, that can't be, that feeling, that is a great challenge to try to translate that feeling into an episode, and you can do it. So figure out what it sounds and feels like, and not just other mediums, but I guess in some ways, in some like ephemeral ways, so like emotional landscapes. All right, let's try another slide. I hope I'm keeping track of where I'm at. So yeah, translate the elements from those influences. What did we want? How did we want this show to feel joyful in the midst of all this gender talk? So keep going, Eric. One more slide. So there's Ernie with his rubber ducky. And I know some of you grew up on Sesame Street, some of you didn't, but there's the famous Rubber Ducky or the One Song. So again, like, it's a very visual show, Sesame Street. How can we bring sort of like the fun of a puppet singing to his rubber ducky into a podcast? So we actually do songs, and we do have sort of like, hopefully the feeling that you're watching a puppet, talk about whatever it is, like, I want to wax my back or something like that. Actually, we've never done a song like that. But the night is still young. Let's go to the next slide. As well, I don't know if this will make sense, but I'm going to go on a little bit left field here. Think about what everybody says, and this is so true, like, speak on what you're an expert about, but also within this medium, not just what you're an expert about, but like, what tools do you have? I was a DJ for years, and I was not a very good DJ, but I was a DJ for years. And I was like, regardless of this show, regardless of what we do for stories, it should sound dope. Like this, I want this show to sound like a freaking jukebox. And that's like from day one till now, like the show, you should be like hitting a jukebox and a 45 record comes down, and either you're in like a boogaloo party from the 1960s or like a funky cocktail party in 1971, even though the show is super contemporary. So that was something where it's like, I can bring that to the table. And also, like, I know how to mix around and I know how to cut dialogue around funky samples. So that was something that was like inherently an aesthetic that could be built in because I had that in my background. Bad DJ, hopefully good podcast producer. Next slide, please. There's Ernie again. I don't know. Oh, there we go. Okay. Translate the elements from other influences. Keep going, Eric. Oh yeah, translate. That's right. Translate the elements from other influences. And so Eric, I'll cue you, but this is where we'll play. Not just yet. I'll let you know. So I want to talk about the show Millennial for a second. And Millennial is no longer in production. It was a show that was produced, I want to say around 2014, 2015 for about 3 years, hosted and produced by Megan Tan, a really talented producer. And it's great. It started out very personal, then it expanded to telling other people's stories. And I will speak very transparently here. Everything that I listed above were some of the steps before starting Other Men Need Help. And I got into a really hard time with that first episode. And I still do. Every season, the first episode is the hardest one. It's the hardest one. It's sort of like creating and setting a template for what's to come for future episodes. We had recorded for episode 1 of Other Men Need Help. We had recorded maybe 2 or 3 drafts, and we were 4 days away from launch. And I listened to the latest cut of it, and I said, this 100% is not working. it's a mess. I was lost. I wasn't really sure what to do. And this is something that what I'm about to tell you, something I've done in the past to also like navigate finding how I would say something, but also you are made up of your influences. I'm not unique in saying that. I knew the first episode of Millennial was beautifully structured. And so this is something that I've done before. I decided to personally transcribe the episode and then try to supplant the first episode of Other Men Need Help on that same beat by beat structure. And if you look at the length of Millennial episode 1 and Other Men Need Help episode 1, they're about 2 minutes off. And the intros are 15 seconds off. And we're going to go, I'm not going to play the first episode intro of Other Men Need Help, but Eric, if we could go to the next slide and let's try playing the Millennial clip. Next slide and clip. So we have this is me, I just transcribed the Millennial first episode. This is the first 2 minutes of the episode. And if it's not working, Eric, we can go without.
One sec, you couldn't hear it?
No.
Oh, okay. One sec. Let me just make sure. One sec. Give me. Ah. It's a good piece. So one sec, I'll make it work. How about? Can you hear that?
These anxious and excited.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Awesome.
Is it possible to play and also have the
Sorry for the technical issues.
No worries. Eric is a wizard, by the way, guys. I don't know if you've done other webinars and he's been here, but he's tremendous. So big applause to Eric.
That's a big intro for what's happening now. Okay, one sec. So let me see.
You're doing great.
Cool. Can you hear this?
School. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Phew. All right. Starting now.
Growing up, I loved school. Even now, when I walk into an office supply store, I get a rush of adrenaline. The smell of new book bags just trigger these anxious and excited feelings that remind me of getting ready for the first day of school. Yeah, I'm that girl. My mom even laughs about my relationship with school.
Your relationship with school was you were born on the first day. You had a relationship coming out of the womb.
So my mom wasn't surprised that when I was 16 years old in high school, while everyone else was looking at cars, I was looking at colleges. I think it's safe to say that I've been waiting to graduate from college for the past 8 years. And up until this point, I thought I'd done everything right. Internships, study abroad. And finally, here I was. As I was walking across the stage, I really wanted to enjoy that moment. But I was thinking about where I was going to be in 2 months. I didn't have a plan for life after graduation. You're listening to Millennial, a podcast series that documents something that no one teaches you: how to maneuver your 20s. A period that everyone goes through and that 80 million people find themselves in right now. Each episode will be documenting what it's like to be one of those millennials.
Great. All right. Thanks. Can you still hear me, Eric? I'm assuming so. Cool.
Yes.
All right, cool. All right, no worries. All right, guys. So I had you just listen to the first 2 minutes of Millennial. Regardless of your thoughts about it, whether you liked it or not, it's perfectly laid out. That is under 2 minutes. Under 2 minutes, the beginning of a series, you have the lead character, you have motivation, you have stakes. You have two scenes, basically 2 scenes in under 2 minutes. You have like a beautiful breakup with music and things like that. It's just, I think it's just really well structured for a first episode. Let's go to the next slide. So this isn't, I just made a sample here. This isn't exactly what I did, but this is something that I would do. Is I would literally, like the slide before, I would literally write out the script of something with as much detail as would be helpful for me. And I would pinpoint how somebody is doing something and then try to replicate it in my own voice. It's as simple as that. Stealing, flattery, whatever it is, imitation, really. But you're made up of your influences. You're made up. You are a listener. Keep going back to that. You are an audience member. So this is just a sort of like sample exercise that I found really helpful for the last 15x 20 years of doing anything creative. I, when in doubt, when I'm having writer's block or whatever it is, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to try to replicate the scene from this. I'm going to look into the science of it. How did this work? And then try and do it in my own voice. I'm going to keep track of time. Let's see if we can get through the rest of these. Thank you, Eric. Let's go to the next slide. Who is your audience? All right. And PRX, it's like in the training team, this is a big freaking thing that they talk about. And it's so important, so important. It's very important to your voice and tone. Who is your audience? Next slide. And do not say, well, it's me, I'm my audience, or your mom, that is not my mom, or everyone. Those are not, that's not like, sure, yes, it would be great if everybody listened to your show. And yes, your mom should, or a family member should love what you do. And yes, of course, you are your own and your first and everything critic. But who is the person that you're trying to reach? Next slide, please. One thing, and PRX talks about empathy interviews, and there's a number of talks, and again, the training team does a really wonderful job about this. But like, who, even before you start, you can try to answer this. Who is your audience avatar, and what does your show provide for them? That is so gonna help the way you are gonna tonally, as well as, I'm going to use vocally, but I don't necessarily mean that in terms of your actual voice, how you are going to talk and communicate to your audience. Next slide. We had a really one slide back to the avatar picture. There he is. Yeah. We had a really interesting time trying to figure out who this show was for. When we started the show 3 or 4 years ago, we thought, there's a lot of big journalism that's going into like the macro issues of masculinity right now. So like people doing the investigative reporting on the Harvey Weinsteins, and the Bill Cosbys and things like that. Like, we're not that show. That work is important and should be done. So who are we trying to reach? We're also trying to reach the everyday guy who feels very removed from the actions of people in power and might say like, I'm having a hard time expressing my feelings, but I don't think I'm doing any damage in the world. And our show is not meant to vilify anybody, but it's definitely meant to ask for accountability. And so this avatar comes from actual interviews that we did to figure out like who we're trying to reach. We don't think we're trying to, like, our audience, we may have sort of like the typical alpha guy, but our audience is more sort of like the beta man. There's a number of ways you can label that, and it keeps changing. Actually, our audience does keep changing. We have a lot of women listen to our show, and we're finding we're a lot of young people. But this is still, when we make an episode, this one audience member, this one person, is who we're speaking to. So this is made up of a few interviews. This is Carlos, a 40-something father of 2, living in a suburb outside of a large West Coast city. He commutes to his job as an educational admin by day and listens to podcasts on his commute to and from and at work. He's progressive, he's fairly introverted, and he has a lot of colleagues, but he's a hard time opening up to men and displaying emotion. He doesn't feel like he has too many close male friends. He likes to listen to shows that make him feel braver. That is how we're reaching that audience member. He likes to listen to shows that make him feel braver and more connected to people. Also, He likes listening to men that sound authentic and make him feel safe enough to open up to other men in his life. He likes to live through the experiences shared by a trusted host. And then there's some lists of his favorite shows there. So this is something you can do even before you get started. This is actually, we're finishing our 3rd season now. We're going back to the drawing board, actually. So this is something you can continue doing because we still get lost. Anytime we get lost during the season, we figure out like, who are we talking to? We threw out 2 episodes this season because they were speaking to the wrong audience. It was wrong tonally for our show to do those episodes because we knew who we were speaking to. There's a lot to say about this, and we know we're getting close on time. So let's skip ahead and I'll get to questions, and I'll try in about 2 minutes. So connecting with that person. I think these are the last things I'll say here. God, there's so much more I want to say, everybody. But this will be my last sort of like big bullet point is how do you connect with that person? You know, hopefully you've done the work of the things I listed above and before, how you would say things, how your show would say things. You know, but if you have an avatar, if you pinpointed who that audience is, how would you want them? How should they receive the kind of show that you're making, or literally your voice? Let's go to the next slide. You know, the way you say things is really, really, really important. This is like a spoken medium, and you're working to create these episodes and to create these arcs of seasons, or however your show is distributed, to try to express something and try to express it in the most authentic way possible. That's how your audience should receive it and say, this person sounds like how they sound. But the thing that we need to remember, besides how we say things, besides everything, all the slides I said before, everything that you're going to do and put into practice to figure out what is the way you and your show is going to speak to a specific voice and tone. Next slide, please. Is to remember the way that you have heard things. How you say things is as important as the way you hear things. We have been responsive from the day we were born to you listening to this webinar, to certain voices, to tones, to even doing mimicry of people in our lives or people that talk to us, from our parents to, you know, celebrities, whatever it is. And what I'm about to say does not come down to you being a good impressionist, a good actor, whatever it is. It comes down to understanding the tone and understanding how you digest even the voices that come into your own life. I didn't want to do a show. Other Men was not going to be a show where I sounded like a shock jock and blah, 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 and whoa, like that. It was not going to do that. Although I've heard that material. It's very jarring to me. I did not need a show where somebody needed to get woken up. Masculinity to me, what was really important for me personally was the ways I felt safe in masculine spaces. Who are the men that spoke to me in my life that not just offered vulnerability, but safety, a feeling of safety? And the easiest tool I have, the easiest tool all of you have, is your literal voice. And the easiest way to better use that tool is to remember who, for me, personally, for this show, the easiest way for me to use that tool was to remember who made me feel safe and how can I replicate that feeling for my audience. And so there's like literally three voices that I literally try to replicate. They're going to sound silly, but my uncle Gil, when he had like a Southwestern pattern growing up, and he was, my brother-in-law, Gil, a Southwestern pattern and cadence of speaking that I found very just comforting. There's a radio DJ and video soul host, old video soul host for those of age here, named Donnie Simpson, just got, I think, into the Radio Hall of Fame, who I always thought was just like a really comforting person. And then John Travolta in the movie Blowout. I just found all those three voices really, really like, I felt safe whenever I was around their voices. And I was like, when in the script, when I'm recording, when I'm talking to that audience, I'm like, how can I give that feeling of listening to my brother-in-law, Gil, to my audience member, Carlos? So remember, voice also means how you receive it and how you received it in the past. We pass down the tools of communication and information. Regardless of the medium, regardless of doing a podcast or whatever it is, in life, that's what we do. We pass down the tools of communication information. And the best that we can do is pass down the positive sides of those. So that's just sort of like a philosophical, as well as like a actually very helpful tool that I've found when it comes to identifying voice and tone. A million other things to say. We're going to cut it there because I know we have questions. And Eric, what's the best thing to do right now? Is it to look at the Q&A chat window, or do you want to moderate it, or?
I'm having a hard time with my mic here. Okay, yes, so I will ask some questions for you if that's okay. Thank you very much, Mark, for an awesome presentation. So Rafi here is asking, I understand the need to go through this process before you start or release your podcast. Could this be part of the process for the growth of the podcast? Can we be figuring out these along the way, releasing one episode after another, or is it preferable to do it all before we start releasing?
Well, I think I have like a mixed answer to that. We in the training team as well talks about this idea of, consistency is the key. So I think as much as you can be honest about how you can be consistent here, and what format, as well as like the tools, everything that's available to you. So and Rafi, I'm sorry, I'm sort of like answer it, but not answer it. The thing is, like, your voice is going to get established the more you do something, but you need to be honest about the level of consistency. And also your audience, you need to get an audience, as well as like the audience has an expectation that your voice, your show is going to be consistent as well. So the main thing is if you're so you're starting your second season, you're starting your show, try to be the best you can, to be honest of like, here's what we can do. We're a 2-person team. We can do 5 episodes. And the way that we can do 5 episodes, it has to be a chat cast, because us 2-person team, we can't do a narrative nonfiction show. And then from there, do as much as you can that I mentioned in the slides, to try to get some understanding while you're starting that. And the other thing that's beautiful too about this medium and anything as well is you could finish those 5 episodes, you've given an audience an expectation, and you could see after those 5 episodes that we were wrong. Our audience is this person, or the medium that really needs to work here is this. So it's sort of a mixture of two. I'd say like sort of like as much as like you and your team can have some level of internal reflection and honesty about the overall like workload that you can handle, and then build all these things into the process. We're finishing our 3rd season now. We've been doing the show for 4 years. Number one, taking a break, but also we're going back to the drawing board, because I'm all of a sudden, we're like, how are we're getting in touch with young people, are getting in touch with like, how are you listening to this show? This is great, but we thought we were speaking to a different audience. So our format, our way may change as well. But the only way we're doing that is that's still 3 or 4 seasons in. We've been consistent in doing it. So hopefully that's helpful context.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, here's another question. Can you walk us through, so from Narissa, can you walk us through translating the visuals into a specific episode script? Meaning, can you talk about episode 3 and the process of creating it?
Yeah, I can try to. So, the second episode of our show was called "I Looked Up Your Ex," and it's an episode that is about that I actually tried to do Other Men Need Help as a video series, because it seemed like the easiest translation of the Sesame Street thing. But my God, for those out there that are doing film and television and video essays and all of that, it's so much goddamn work to do it. And I love it as a medium. Podcasting is as well. Podcasting is a lot of work. Anyway, I'll try to answer this question. But that episode really was like, this needs to be visual. This really needs to be visual. How can we turn this into a podcast? So I worked with Iga, and she came up with this emblem, and like, how would I Looked Up Your Ex? First off, how would that look as a children's book? And she came up with this illustration of sort of like 2 what's the word? Flaccid phalluses basically, but flaccid guns, like a gun duel. I think, or no, they're not flaccid, they're barking at each other. But I think the sort of like the intonation there is that they're a bit flaccid, but like two barking guns. And so we tried to turn it into, the script itself was about a 12-page script, and we tried to make each beat of it like you were turning the page of a children's book. So building off of it a little bit. Now we did bring, it starts off with sort of like the character, I'm going to speak of myself in third person, but like the character of Mark in South America, feeling insecure around this Adonis guy. And we tried to bring as much visualness as we could. So like, what are sort of like the beats in a children's book? You know, if it was about a man being jealous of another man, it might be the guy taking his shirt off at the beach and women whistling or something like that. How would that look in a book? And then how sonically? And so it's like, it's like an animated, I mean, the challenge was turning something into like, how can we give the principles of something that's animated? So we did actually have whistles. We had a really fun, funky soundtrack that went with it. And yeah, I think it's mostly trying to fit the beats of trying to make it a children's book. And also like the almost naive honesty and observation of a children's book. When you're going through something from like a character's perspective in a children's book, you sort of see them eyeing the world in a way that's like so beautifully honest. And how can you do that in the body of somebody who's in their mid to late 30s? So I hope that's helpful. But that's really been our principle to try to, you know, for each season. This season as well is a little bit of a children's book way of doing things. But we've also looked at different things. We've wanted this season is thematic. So we've looked at it like an album. Like we didn't look at Abbey Road, but like how has Abbey Road been structured so that this episode lands here, this episode lands here. And we had a few albums that we looked at to try to lay out this season. So hopefully that's helpful to try to figure out what your medium is and then like the best principles of it, putting it into the way you structure an episode or a full season arc.
Thank you, Mark. There's so many good questions, and I feel like we can be here for a long time, but I'm going to try to go through two more if that's okay. So this one is Elias asking, my question is, how often do you crowdsource ideas for episodes, and what is one of the most memorable episodes that came out from a pitch you received by email? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, I think I'm going to answer this and also answer going back to sort of like the overall topic of this. What's really beautiful about pitches, and for you all receiving pitches, if that's what the kind of show you're doing, is that if you can answer everything that we did in this presentation, you automatically know like this isn't right for the show. And that's been something that's really, really helpful with pitches coming in, where somebody will send something. It's like, this just isn't the show that this should land on. Actually, the one pitch that came in was very inadvertent. It's actually the last episode we did. We released it last week. There are 2 episodes this season, one of which was kind of a pitch, but it was my pitch to the team in a way. I told the team, I was like, look, for this season, look out all over like your social media, people you're seeing, like, let's try to find everyday stories. The new season of Other Men Need Help is about friendship. Like, how are we observing friendship in modern life? And so I told the team to do that. And we found a Facebook post from a friend of mine that we ended up building a whole episode around, like the oral history of this Facebook post. And it became like, it's one of my favorite episodes I think that we've ever done. So that's sort of like an internal pitch. The other was a pitch that came in from somebody I know. And he got in touch with me last year and he said, I know you're doing a season. We posted a number of places. We're doing a season about this. This is the kind of stories we're looking for. And he said, I've got a story, like an old story about childhood. And he came in. I know he's a great sort of like natural storyteller. And I was like, come in, let's sit and talk with the mic on. And he came and talked to me and he's like, I actually don't want to talk to you about this today. I got a text exchange with a friend of mine. It's really pissing me off. We built an episode around that bait and switch. Not a bait and switch. He wasn't trying to trick me, but that's what happened in the midst of like him pitching a story. So I think it's like number one, trusting the people that you're going to get random pitches, but trusting that they are speaking to the tone of the show. Some people you may know, but also it's just like, we know sort of like what we're trying to unearth with sort of stories we tell. And I think most of you will as well with whatever you're trying to do. So those are two recent ones from this season that really stood out.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. Do you mind if I ask one last question?
No, I got time. So
Cool,
it's
thank
up
you.
to you guys. Yeah,
Cool.
I'm free to go.
Thank you. Daniel is asking, is it possible to share some examples of the questions you asked when interviewing people when profiling your audience member avatar?
That's a great question, and it really depends. So the first thing I think we ask people is, some like demographic questions. So start there, find out what you can. Where are you? What do you do? Blah blah blah. All of this. Where do you listen to podcasts? What do you listen to? So stuff like that. But you're not doing this so much you want demographic information. I mean, you want to know that somebody who might listen to your show also listens to 99% Invisible. I mean, that is something that is important to know. But just as you should be a good interviewer, like just be curious. Like why, I'm always curious too, why people do and listen to certain things. Personally, 2 years ago or so, I started listening to these like really long movie podcasts. Which I wouldn't advise any of them. They're mostly, it's like movie podcasts. It's like a lot of times it's like 2 or 3 guys. The mic, it's like right here, like right on top of each other. But I'll listen to these things. I'm like, what am I doing? Like, why? I like movies, but like, why? I wouldn't think I'm the audience member. I'm making a show that's narrative nonfiction. I listen to a lot of shows, and I realized that me personally, my life at the time was so stressful. I just wanted somebody to talk to me about movies for hours. Like that's all I wanted as an audience member. I wasn't listening to a lot of narrative nonfiction those days. I was like, I just want to be comforted by talking about movies and having some voices, just like goof off and stuff like that. And again, I wouldn't think I'm the person, but that is important I think it's important for shows like that, or for any show, to know like what you're giving this person. And so coming down to questions, just paying attention to like, we found the most fascinating details out from our audience members. We really, find out what their habits are, what their personal lives are like, what their relationships are like with their siblings, with something like other men need help, what their relationship is with their like self-identifying with masculinity. Do they have friends? When do they listen to a show? When is the time that the show like really hits for them? Is it during their commute, or it's like, I'm in a really bad marriage and I just take a walk with the dog and I listen to 99% Invisible or whatever it is. Like those things are really, and it goes, I mean, it really becomes almost ethereal in a way, because it's like when I sit in this closet right here to record since quarantine with like a blanket over me, it is not the most fun thing to do. It's really tight in there. My groin gets squeezed. I have to try to do 45 minutes in there. It gets sweaty during the summer. And like when it comes down to it, remembering Carlos does help, not just because it still fixates on the tone of the show, but it's like, I know that Carlos has a rough commute. Like I know that Carlos is like really struggling to connect with his older brother. And I don't know. I hope that doesn't sound pompous or like or anything like that, but it's like we do this because it's a connected medium. And I think in the ways that like you ask these questions, you translate that to the way that you record and create these episodes. And it should translate to the way that you ask the questions when you sit down with somebody, just to find out like, why do you listen to podcasts in general? Or like, why do you read that book? I'm always fascinated by the habits of others and what the material, how we gravitate to the material that we gravitate towards. Like I think everything, it doesn't necessarily need to be depressing, but like what void or what does it speak to in others' lives? So as much as you can sort of like navigate to those questions, and just being curious, besides all the demographic stuff, so you can answer the reason Carlos, the reason Jasmine, the reason Yolanda listens to our show, besides liking shows like The Moth, is because when she listens to her show, she feels safe. It makes her feel safe to, and now I'm blanking, but like it, or maybe not even something like that. It's just like she needs somebody to talk very calmly to her when she gets off her shift at the hospital, so find that stuff out.
Thank you, Mark. I feel like we need to continue this conversation over a virtual coffee or something. But thank you for a great presentation and for your time. And thank you all for asking great questions. Anything else, Mark, before we sign off?
Thank you all. Well, I mean, I think just, I have to say this on every Zoom call, every webinar. I hope that everybody listening is healthy, just in general. It's a really weird year. So I hope you and your families are healthy. I hope you're able to and I really do mean that for all of us. I hope we have a better 2021. And then as well, like I'm really excited about the growing landscape and what people are doing. Take risks. I really hope people are taking risks, trying things. I hope as well you're able to add this webinar is growing and it keeps changing. So come back to me, say like, I learned something and I think you should update this. The other thing too is like, please, we love listeners. We love people to listen if the show fits for you. And just kind of going on one of those last questions, if you want to get in touch, like I said, I'll try my best to answer questions if you send an email to othermenneedhelp@gmail.com. But if you know the show and you have an idea, we're taking a break, but we're coming back and we're sort of amorphous right now. We've got some ideas of what we're going to do next, but we'd love to hear from you. We'd love ideas. We'd love other stories. So get in touch and yeah, we'll talk.
Thank you so much, Mark. And for those people who have more questions, and we have more information on our website, googlecp.prx.org, googlecp.prx.org. There you will find the links to register for the upcoming webinars. There will be 5 more, and so check it out when you get a chance. And then last thing I want to plug is our virtual live event that's happening on Saturday, November 21st. So it's coming up like in a little over a week, Saturday, November 21st. It's a kind of like a festival networking kind of vibe, the day-long virtual experience where we try to connect podcasters with each other and provide tangible resources and allow people to see each other's faces. And it's for, if you're an independent, early stage DIY podcaster, who have some experience in education, but you want to have connection with people. This is, something that I highly recommend checking out. We'll host it on a platform called Hopin. It's a really cool, sleek, user-friendly platform. So you can just like hop into a stage section, a networking section, and then like, different webinar, small group gatherings that we call huddles. So it'll be a cool virtual experience. Again, go check out our website, googlecp.prx.org. googlecp.prx.org to find out more. All right. And that's all from us. Thank you so much. Mark, good to see you.
Thank you. And I want to give a shout out to Eric and the training team. Thank you guys for putting on these webinars. It's really a fantastic team. They're really wonderful, great resources. So I want to plug them as well. And I want to thank you guys for giving us all this great access.
Thank you, Mark. And on that note, shout out to my colleagues, Steph and Tony, who are in the background helping out with answers and Q&As. All right, thank you. Have a good one, everyone. Take care. Bye.